So today's report is of DPH or diphenhydramine at 600 milligrams. I found on Erowid by a user called Desperate Psychenauts, and the full details are on screen now. On a chilly, boring February evening, my friends A, male, similar sized build to me, he says he's 140 pounds, and I met up at Elle's dorm with the intention of getting fucked up. 0 minutes. A and I each took 600 milligrams of CVS generic brand Benadryl, 25 milligrams per pill, with respectable quantities of water on fairly empty stomachs. This was A's first time trying Benadryl. I had done this 3 or 4 times before. Elle abstained. I had warned her that the Benadryl experience was powerful and unusual, but not necessarily pleasant. The 3 of us went on a short walk to give the drug time to absorb. 45 minutes. Having returned from the walk and settled into Elle's room, we started to feel the effects. A was very silent most of the evening, henceforth I will report on what I observed. An initial gradual wave overtook me with a buzz similar to that of having a couple shots of hard liquor. After several minutes, this wave resolved itself into a slightly strange feeling, best described as slight dizziness, mild hunger, mild nausea, and slight heaviness of the limbs. 1 hour. By this point, the body dysphoria had reached a fairly uncomfortable potential. The heaviness had reached the point of feeling like a mild uncomfortable pressure over one's body. A was reclining, and I lay down on the floor and began to stare at the ceiling. After a few brief moments, the ceiling started to fade from whitish to greyish. Continuing to stare, I noticed a grid fade into view. This grid of white on the grey ceiling resembled a large fishnet. It was not a rectangular grid, but rather one that had been pulled and stretched a bit to give it several random angular warpings, like a carpet pulled in several places after moving pieces of furniture. Over top of the grid, I began to see small blobs of white that shone brightly for a second and then vanished again, creating a twinkling effect. Eventually, I began to see large blurry lines that resembled out-of-focus lighting sparking across my field of vision. These types of monotone imagery persisted over my field of vision no matter where I looked, but most were prominent when looking at simple expanses of one colour or pattern. Colours were brighter and more vivid, edges between objects were shadowed, similar to overlaying the output of an edge detection algorithm. 1 hour 15 minutes. Someone was flicking a brightness switch back and forth. It seemed as if the entire room kept alternating between different levels of overall light. Every second or so, the brightness of everything changed dramatically. The physical discomfort could now largely be ignored, but it was still present. Xerostromic and diuretic effects begin to set in strongly, and xerostromic is just a fancy word for dry mouth. 1 hour 30 minutes. My short-term memory became impaired. I would be thinking about something, then suddenly I would forget whether I was thinking about it or talking about it out loud. Thinking I have been saying it out loud, I would continue to speak about it. Elle would just ask, "What are you talking about?" prompting a quick, "Never mind." It was not that thoughts disappeared, but that meta-properties of thoughts were lost. I could not remember if I'd heard something or imagined it. 2 hours. By this point, my active thoughts and sensory information were thoroughly confused. I could often not tell if something was real or in my head. At one point, I watched some small white worm wriggling across the floor. I tried to catch it, but then it disappeared. Audio was recognizing incorrectly. In other words, I would hear something, but recognize it as something it wasn't. I knew I'd recognized it incorrectly, but I could not recognize it correctly, which was rather frustrating. This began to happen with my vision later, but my memory began to get very fuzzy at this point. Sometime later, A walked home. He told us later that he would be talking to both me and Elle while walking, then suddenly realised he was walking home alone and Elle and I were still in Elle's room. He also reports being unable to find his own room for a while, and at one point entering someone else's room because he thought it was his. I couldn't understand why they would put someone else's name on my door. I figured someone just thought it would be funny to write the wrong name up on my door and take my name down. Whenever I got up to use the restroom, I would feel an uncomfortable heaviness at first. But then, if I simply ignored it and pushed myself harder, I could move and walk fairly well. Everything seemed strange and out of place, but I could find my way reasonably well. At one point, I forgot what month it was, and was hurriedly packing my stuff to go home for spring break. A reports that he felt dizzy the whole evening and spent most of the next day sleeping. I managed to carry on 2 phone calls at about 4.5 and 5 hours in, although I confused the first caller with another friend of mine and said some things that didn't make sense. Falling asleep was bizarre, because I would slide in and out of dreaming, hypnagogia, and waking hallucinations. It was almost as if my mind was in a perpetual hypnagogic state. I managed to make it to my classes the next day. I simply felt empty during the first one at roughly 14 hours after taking. I went to lunch at 18 hours before my second class, which was around 19.5 hours, and my friends told me that I seemed very spacey. There were very light visual effects through the whole day, like whitish specks and streaks that would jump around sporadically, but my sense of my vision system is telling me the truth was much stronger, and I was not mentally confused. I think I was fully sober around the 28-hour mark or so. Overall, I would rate the diphenhydramine experience in general a C-. Some of the visuals were very interesting, but I had no more than a few initial minutes of mental pleasantries, and the physical sensation was bizarre and confusing, leaving a foul taste in the proverbial mouth. I would liken the experience to being drunker than drunk, but not really in a good way, or something like acute dementia/delirium.